Welcome to the 2014 NBA Draft.
We've spent a lot of time talking about this. What should the Cavs do with the pick?
I think that Wiggins is going to be an excellent NBA player, but Parker is the sure thing.
The 2014 draft is the classic example of a draft where the players that were expected to be franchise-changing superstars were not. And while the top of the class was filled with underachieving prospects and role players, the biggest gem of this class happened all the way down at number 41, in the middle of a Taco Bell commercial, no less.
Two things you only dreamed would come.
At the time of the draft, however, the 2014 class was deemed as one of the greatest group of prospects in a long time. From Wiggins and Parker's otherworldly potential to Joel Embiid, a project center who started to play basketball late in life, but had a natural grasp for the game that made teams wonder, should he be the number one pick? It was a class filled with surprises, with some crucial players being drafted later down the board, while at the top of the class, however, there was more disappointment than you can guess. So in this video, let's take a look at one of the most iconic draft classes of the 2010s decade, and the roller coaster of a ride these players went through. Coming into the 2014 draft, all the headlines were focused on two players in particular, Andrew Wiggins and Jabari Parker. I mean, even before they got drafted, they spurned a rivalry that was projected to be as prominent as the likes of Magic or Bird. A rivalry of two players, similar height, similar attitude, the same goal, to become the next face of basketball. Unfortunately, we all know how their careers panned out. While Wiggins spent years in Minnesota with the green light to do whatever he wanted to do, whenever he wanted to, he never developed into a legitimate number one option, or the superstar that most scouts predicted he'd become. Perhaps the Wolves being an absolute disaster of a team during that time also didn't help his progression. But there were too many flaws in his game, and for a long time, he was seen as nothing more than a hyper-athletic forward who was a streaky shooter and an even worse decision-maker, with zero playmaking skills. It wasn't until a trade to Golden State where he found his niche, and reinvigorated his career as a defensive powerhouse.
Drives on Wiggins, pull-up shot blocked by Wiggins.
Heck, Wiggins was arguably the second most important player in their run to the 2022 championship. He even made the All-Star team for the first time, as a starter, no less. Which, I mean, it was probably the weakest All-Star starter in a long time, but still. He deserved the recognition for how he turned his career around. Soon, all those folks in the back yelling "bust" became quiet. Sadly, the same fortune did not happen to Jabari Parker. Unlike Wiggins, Parker's early years were marred with injuries and a heavy critique of his effort and inability to stay in shape. He struggled with that mentally, and as the injuries piled up and his defense never improved, Parker was deemed as too slow, too sluggish, too lethargic to play at the NBA level. That's why, by the age of 26, he fell out of the NBA, and despite numerous attempts at making a comeback, it still has yet to happen. It's not that rare to see overhyped prospects flame out quickly as folks realize their skills are not fit for the modern NBA game. It is rare, however, to see two prospects, the unequivocal top two of the class, with this much anticipation, yet neither of them lived up to it. But that's okay. The third pick of the draft, Joel Embiid, certainly made up for that.
The Philadelphia 76ers select Joel Embiid from Yaoundé, Cameroon.
The Philadelphia 76ers had ambitions and goals, just like everyone else. Their strategy? To lose on purpose by playing guys who are G League players, who simply don't belong in the NBA. For years, they used this strategy to compile a boatload of high draft picks. But when it all comes down to it, out of like 8 top 10 picks, Embiid was the only one who panned out and succeeded. You've heard me say on this channel the phrase roller coaster of a career quite often. It's one of my favorite things to say, and there's no better way to describe Embiid's career than this phrase. On one hand, he's an all-time dominant center, a former MVP with his brute size, strength, skill, and defensive prowess which can only be matched by a handful of players in history. On the other hand, his recurring knee injuries have been the bane of his existence. His lower body injuries in general have been harsh. He missed his first 2 years after getting drafted and still managed to immediately produce when he first stepped foot on the court. As dominant as he is, or was, at his peak, there is a decent portion of the fan base who do not like him, either for his flopping antics or his reckless movements. I don't think there's a superstar as polarizing as Embiid in the modern generation. He's kinda like the center version of James Harden, who was also quite polarizing back in his day due to his playstyle. Nevertheless, of the top 3 in this class, Embiid certainly did most of the heavy lifting. Had his career flamed out early, it might have been the worst top 3 of the decade. Embiid saved them from being so. At pick number 4, it's none other than the 2-time robbed slam dunk champion, Aaron Gordon. I put him in a similar category as Wiggins in the sense that, in his early years, he looked lost in Orlando. They wanted him and needed him to do too much, and experimented with his skill set in numerous ways, such as trying him out as the primary scorer, then trying him as a point forward, and then giving him the green light to create his own shots. While Gordon is decent at most of these things, those were never his strengths. It wasn't until he arrived in Denver when Nikola Jokic unlocked his true power: dunking.
Nuggets have hit 6 of their last 7. Jokic setting the table for Gordon.
Well, we all knew he was great at dunking, but by playing with an all-time passer like Jokic, Gordon doesn't need to do everything he was asked to do in Orlando anymore. He can now focus on the skills he's good at, like getting positioned down low and taking most of his shots at the basket now. He went from roughly 1/3 of his shots in the restricted area to over half in his time in Denver. And along with his change in shot selection came a super nice increase in efficiency. Remember in Orlando how it sometimes looked like he was taking Kobe-level shots, tough, contested fadeaways, with a hand in his face. It was a struggle to score, and he was overwhelmed by everything he was tasked to do. I think Gordon is the perfect example of a player who he was never a bust to begin with, but if you get drafted to a team that puts you in the wrong role, you're never gonna succeed. Sometimes all it takes is a change of scenery for a player to reach the level they always had inside of them. The 5th pick, Dante Exum, unfortunately found himself on the brink of an NBA departure right when his career began. His injuries, his luck was strikingly bad, as he seemingly got hurt at every opportunity when it seemed like he was making progress. It was setback after setback after setback in Utah. On paper, this dude was a unicorn, a 6'6" point guard who drew comparisons to the likes of Penny Hardaway and Grant Hill. For his incredibly versatile arsenal, a blend of athleticism, high basketball intuition, and passing skills made him look wiser beyond his years. Exum had so many strengths and a very good head above his shoulders, but he had a hard time translating his skills onto the court. Of course, constantly being in rehab doesn't help either, and having a completely broken jump shot. 2 years, that's how long he spent overseas. Exum recited the moments where he thought he would never return to the NBA, and that his career was over just like that. But after 2 years in Europe, Exum returned to the NBA with a vengeance.
A 3 will tie it. A handoff to Luka. Back to Exum. Got it.
Now a much more mature veteran, equipped with an actual jump shot that made him a key cog in the Mavs' run to the finals. Upon his return, which kinda came out of nowhere, he responded, "Obviously, with the injuries that happened, it kind of stunted my growth a little bit. But I never backed away from the confidence that I had, and I knew that I do belong in this league." The 6th pick, Marcus Smart. The interesting thing about Smart is that he turned into a completely different player in the NBA compared to his days in college and high school, initially drawing comparisons to Dwayne Wade in the draft. Smart obviously did not come close to that, but immediately upon joining the Celtics, he established a level of leadership and he played with his heart on his sleeve every game. Smart was always the first to dive to the floor, the first to get to the loose ball. The hustle and effort exhibited was what Celtics fans loved to see, and he quickly became a fan favorite. As the Celtics were going through a transition period from the former Big Three into the Isaiah Thomas, then the Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown era, Smart was pivotal not just as a leader but as someone with no ego. He accepted whatever role the Celtics needed him to play. Whether it's coming off the bench or starting, defending the opposing team's best guards, Smart would do everything he was asked to do. While he never blossomed into the kind of scorer that he was projected to be, he maximized his talent as a role player, and that's something we should all appreciate. The 7th pick, it's my favorite player, Julius Randle. You know what's funny? Randle is the 7th pick, but as I'm making this video, I just realized he's the only other player in this class who made an All-NBA team besides Embiid and Jokic. I don't think that's gonna change either, with the 2014 class being over a decade into their careers, but I don't know how I feel about that. I guess I was wrong in thinking this class was stronger than I thought. It actually shows how weak this class is. In terms of individual accolades, it's literally just Jokic and Embiid carrying the whole class. Either way, at the 7th pick, Randle has performed better than basically everyone else ahead of him besides Embiid. As I mentioned, even the best players of this class have been quite polarizing, and Randle is no exception, as his highest of highs are matched by his lowest of lows. In fact, his pre-draft projection matched exactly the type of player he became. An extremely skilled power forward with an all-around offensive arsenal that's so rare and unique. Yet, his decision-making and ability to maximize his skill set has always been a hit or miss. I'm not sure he'll ever get it together. Picks 8 through 12. There's not much to discuss here. 5 players who've been role players for a decade, some of whom are already out of the NBA. Out of these 5 guys, I'd say Elfrid Payton had the highest chance to become something more. For a short time, he was one of the league's best passers, and that kind of vision separates him from the others on this list. After he was out of the league for 2 or 3 years, he came back, he signed with the Pelicans, and randomly had a 21-assist game. Still, he played for some horrendous teams for his entire career, only making the playoffs twice in 10 seasons. I think he'd look pretty good if he was a backup point guard on a contending team, but he's never had a chance to be one. Payton is certainly very skilled and very smart. It's just he hasn't found the right opportunity yet. At number 13, Zach LaVine. Personally, I still believe he's the most underrated shooting guard of the modern era, but he's flown under the radar for years now.
Zach LaVine, and look out below!
In Minnesota, he first gained recognition for being the key piece the Bulls got in return for Jimmy Butler. With Jimmy's departure 1 year later, the Wolves essentially lost LaVine for nothing. In Chicago, he developed into the team's primary option, displaying a level of shooting that rivals the best shooters ever. Heck, if there was one player I'd bet on who can win both a dunk contest and three-point shooting contest, you gotta pick LaVine. Yet, despite playing in Chicago for a long time, and as the Bulls ranked number 1 or close to number 1 in attendance for years now, LaVine's consistent production was overshadowed. Nobody realized his 2024-25 season has been the best shooting season he's ever had. It's kinda what happens when your team is perennially mediocre, always fighting for a spot in the play-ins. Now, with LaVine as the 13th pick, he would be the final All-Star of this draft class, all the way until Jokic at the 41st pick. In between these 28 picks, you have a smattering of role players, guys like TJ Warren, Yusuf Nurkic, Gary Harris, Rodney Hood, Clint Capella, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Kyle Anderson, Joe Harris, who even led the league in three-point percentage at one point, Spencer Dinwiddie, and Jeremy Grant. None of these players have ever made any All-NBA or All-Defensive or any All-Star teams, but they've spent many years as productive role players for their respective teams. Interestingly, the goldmine of this class came within the middle of the draft, from the mid to late first round to the early second round picks. These players have produced more than most lottery picks, and if it wasn't for these guys, the 2014 draft would without question be the worst of the decade. But because of the surprising amount of depth, it's not the worst of the decade. That brings us to the 41st pick. Here's a fun fact. As of this video, the total cumulative number of All-Star selections this class has is 20. The total number of All-NBA selections is 13. Jokic and Embiid combined for 14 of those 20 All-Star selections, and 11 of those 13 All-NBA selections. Yeah, these two guys are carrying the entire class on their backs. And we look at MVPs, we know how that looks. all 4 MVPs are between these two. Though by the end of their careers, Jokic will most certainly have a couple more, and the separation between him and the rest of the draft will grow larger every year. It's funny, when this draft happened, most believed this would be a 2-man draft, but between Wiggins and Parker, not these two revolutionary big men. Embiid was seen as a risky, hit-or-miss prospect. Due to his sheer size, he was just as likely to become the next Hakeem Olajuwon as he was to become the next Hasheem Thabeet. Jokic, though, nobody saw him coming from a mile away. The only thing the scouts saw in him was a slow, pudgy European with a 5-inch vertical. One can say Embiid has reached his maximum potential, and Jokic has exceeded beyond anything we could have imagined. So after Jokic, the last 20 picks of the class, nothing really stood out. There was Jordan Clarkson at number 46, another great steal for a second-round pick. Oh, and who can forget? The GOAT Nepo brother, Thanasis Adetokounmpo. That was the 2014 NBA draft class. All in all, in terms of all-stars and individual accolades, it was a very shallow class. 2 superstars headlined this class and saved it from being horrible, but overall, a lot of disappointment in the first 15 picks. And I feel like a lot of those players could have seen a different career trajectory if they got drafted to a different team, a better situation. Alas, just for having Jokic by himself, this will never be considered a, bad class. This class will always be remembered, the greatest second-round pick of all time. And with how advanced scouting has become in recent years, it's hard to miss another player like him. So he'll be holding that honor for a long, long time. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Where do you think the 2014 draft ranks among all classes of the 2010s? In the middle or on the lower end? What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.